Thanks. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Washington and Lee Chapel for those of you who are just in town visiting. I know there are a few of you. I'm Paul Youngman, and I'm the chair of the Department of German and Russian, but more relevant and germane to this gathering tonight, I'm the chair of the Digital Humanities Committee, actually the founding chair of the Digital Humanities Committee. Something called Digital Humanities is fairly new, and I'll try to explain that in a second. In fact, this may be the first Digital Humanities talk in Lee Chapel. It's got to be. I've never seen a screen in Lee Chapel. Has anybody else seen a screen in Lee Chapel? It's a first for me. So I don't have the privilege tonight of introducing our esteemed colleague. That honor is going to fall to Mark Connor, our provost tonight. I wanted to, though, to take a minute to provide a little bit of context for tonight's lecture. So Professor Ayers, as you may or may not know, is a renowned historian who's known in part for his work in something that we call digital humanities. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this thing called digital humanities, I'd say that it's really a recognition on the part of humanities and social science professors that information is no longer conserved solely in the form of a book. And it's our responsibility as professors of humanities and professors of social sciences to make sure that our students are aware of that and know how to deal with that, to make sure that they understand that there are many, many digital methods available to them to conduct research and many, many digital pathways for them to present that research, so different than a book and different than an article. And I'm not suggesting that digital is better, it offers certain advantages, it's just another outlet for us to deal with. So it was our intention tonight to bring Professor Ayers here so that he can show the university community exactly how this works in his field, the field of U.S. history. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce the Joe M. and James Ballingy Professor of English and Interim Provost of the University, Mark Connor.
Thank you so much, Paul. Wonderful to see everybody here. Let me echo Paul's welcome. It's my honor to introduce Ed Ayers, who is a remarkable example of the teacher-scholar. And I want to begin by posing this question: what does it mean to study and teach history in the digital age? Let's consider Ayers's In the Valley of the Shadow, Two Communities in the American Civil War, a digital archive of primary historical sources from Augusta County, Virginia, and Franklin County, Pennsylvania, south and north, before, during, and after the Civil War. This archive documents the lives of many people, ordinary and extraordinary. It offers letters, maps, diaries, newspapers, speeches, government documents. It is more like a library than a single book. This archive is democratic, multi-voiced, textured, bringing into relief the complexity of what history might be telling us. Let's consider Backstory with the American History Guys, a major podcast presentation on public radio, examining major and minor current events through the lens of history, with nearly 400,000 online plays per month. A history of censorship, a history of police. This is a real rabbit's hole down which the interested listener can lose many hours of her life, and a wonderful immersion in the dynamic discussion of history, trying to answer the question, how did we end up here over the flow of time? Now, 20 years ago, we might have said, this is Ed Ayers's non-traditional scholarship. What about his traditional scholarship? His books, awards, papers, titles, and those are legion. Author or editor of 11 books, recipient of multiple awards, former professor of history and dean of the college at UVA, former president of the University of Richmond, current Tucker Boatwright professor of the Humanities at Richmond. He's got all of that. But I just want to close by remarking that in our current age, that divide between traditional and non-traditional scholarship has fallen. The materials in the Valley of the Shadow form the main content of his prize-winning book, In the Presence of Mine Enemies, The Civil War in the Heart of America. All of this work, from digital mapping to edited volumes to irreverent and fascinating podcasts to serving as president of a university with its own complicated, vexing, and challenging past, it's all of a piece. We are fortunate indeed to have intellectuals such as Ed Ayers to guide us through these tangled forests of interpretation. So please join me in welcoming Ed Ayers.
Great, thank you. Hey, it's good to see everybody. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me to WNL. What a great school. I kind of resent you. When I was president of the University of Richmond, a valiant foe for excellent students. But we're both good, so it's great to be here and to be in Lee Chapel and kind of breaking in the screen. I feel like I'm contributing something useful here, even if I don't say anything useful. I'm a big fan of Ken Ruscio and good friends as presidents and kind of talking about the interesting opportunities and challenges of that job, and the fact that we're both kind of moving on to other things about the same time gives me some confidence that maybe it wasn't a mistake. So, digital history and the Civil War and digital history. So, as Provost Connor said, I've been working on it for a long time, and as I was saying to him, the Venn diagram of people who are interested in new approaches to history and people interested in the Civil War is not the most obvious place, so that's where I decided to go. And why would I go to all this trouble? So the Valley of the Shadow now, it was started almost 25 years ago, and before the web, actually. And then when the web came along, we were able to catch that wave, and it's been exciting ever since. And we're doing some new projects at UR that I'll talk about that. So why would I do that? I'll be honest with you. This feels faintly sacrilegious right here, but I grew up right across the Virginia line in the Tri-Cities area, and the greater Tri-Cities area, we prefer to call it. And I couldn't have cared less about the Civil War. I asked my grandfather one time why we never talked about it. He said, "Son, we just shot each other." I went to Andrew Johnson Elementary School, and so it's kind of an anomalous place. And then going to graduate school in the 70s in the wake of Vietnam, nobody would think about the Civil War as an object of study. Then I went to UVA for 10 years and wrote about a bunch of other stuff, but not the Civil War. And finally, I was driving on 81 one day and remembered a line from the Bible, the Valley of the Shadow of Death, because I don't think there's a more beautiful place in America than the Shenandoah Valley. And it occurred to me to live in such a beautiful place and for people here with just that line on the ground up the Mason-Dixon line to decide in a few months that they would kill each other. It was a very hard thing to explain that we kind of take for granted now. If you told anybody that 6 months before they did, they wouldn't have believed you. So we're going to look at that a little bit. So why did I go to digital history? Well, partly, as you heard, is to include as many people in the story as possible. My passion in history is to make a history that includes as many people as possible and reaches as many people as possible. But the Civil War needs something else that the digital provides, which is being able to see complexity. We simplify the Civil War at every chance. No matter what part of the country you're in, people will just say, well, it was just about this or it was just about that. And explaining away the most complicated and momentous event in our nation's history was something that would fit on a bumper sticker. And it doesn't. So we need to be able to see the complexity of an event that took place over an area the size of continental Europe, that killed the equivalent today of 8 million people, and that ended the largest slave empire in the modern world and saved the largest participatory democracy in the world. And yet somehow we decided if you're interested in that, you're a buff. We don't have World War II buffs. Civil War buff. We kind of domesticated it. So I wanted to make people understand how complicated it was. I wanted people to understand something that we can't really do in our heads, which is to tell two stories at the same time. We don't have the capacity to do simultaneity. And yet the Civil War in many ways is all about simultaneity. And the best we can come up with is, meanwhile, that's all we got, and flip the toggle on that. Wouldn't it be great if we could see that? And it wouldn't be great if we could find a way to tell the story of slavery and of military history and of political history and of women's history and of economic history and religious history, all in the same frame, just the way they're lived. We're very busy separating out these different strands, and I thought it would be better if we actually put them all together. And I think it's also good for history to constantly be making itself new. I told my mom, a fifth grade teacher, I was going to go to graduate school in history, and she said, well, what for, honey? We already know what happened. And so now for decades, I've been trying to show her, no, we don't. It's a lot more complicated than we thought. So that's one reason I'm happy to do backstory. It's one reason I'm happy to do digital history. It's one reason I taught a class earlier today in Richmond, because we need to keep making the past new. So people have been thinking about this sort of thing for a long time. And here is one way that people try to do it. Is that going to come up? I've clicked on it. Do I need to do anything else to make it happen? So, people have been trying to do this for a long time. And I was invited by your fellow Lexingtonians at the Institute to give a talk. And I showed this crazy thing, and that you're going to see now too when it comes up on the screen behind us. And what it is in the 1890s, it occurred to a guy that it would be great to put the entire Civil War on one page of a poster that you could buy. And he built an entire company out of this. And I so wish I could show you what it looks like, because as well as the other 15 things that I'm getting ready to show you, I can do, there we go. Thank you very much. So it's not mirroring. So can I'm sorry, I'll need to be able to see all those tabs that I had. So whatever you need to do on that, or otherwise, it's hand shadows for 50 minutes. It's going to come up. So I'll talk about this. So this is called, and what is this, you may say? This is 1890s. And it's every battle in the Civil War mapped, and these are states. And as you can imagine, right here, Virginia gets the broadest one. And these are all the things happening from the top to the bottom across time. And then Mississippi, Tennessee going. And then over on the side, this is the value of gold for the Union. These are the size of the armies. So these things are mapped in time and place. And it came with a big guide that you could see what each of these little dots meant. Now, there's lots of dots here that were called minor engagements, which I identify as an engagement in which you were not involved. Otherwise, every engagement is really significant. So this is when I would go to the next slide, but did we lose all those tabs? Excellent. And just go ahead and click on the next one. There we go. Thanks very much. I can turn around and look at that. I didn't know they were up there. It's just not mirrored. I'm good. As long as I don't see Tina, as long as everybody else doesn't see Tina Fey in the commercial that I'm seeing there, we're good. All right? So here's one way to think about all this. So at Richmond, we started the Digital Scholarship Lab, and we're making a digital atlas of American history. The last one of these was made in 1933, the last historical atlas of the United States. And that's what this is. And we animated, do I not have control of the cursor? I don't believe I do. I believe it's on this screen. So if you'd like to fool with it a little bit more, that would be great, because I can't control what's up here. Matter of fact, so I'm just not going to for that. Imagine, if you will, that this map from 1933 is animated and moving across the United States. At the end of this atlas, which took them 30 years to make, there's a line that we use as our quotation. It's really hard to show change over space and time in a book. The ideal historical atlas would be images projected on the screen of a book without a projector and screen. They're imagining an iPad. Imagine, instead of drawing arrows, that we could actually watch people move. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to seize our moment in history to say we have capacities that we couldn't imagine when we started 20 years ago. When I started the Valley of the Shadow, PDF files didn't exist, if young people can imagine that there was such a time. And that there was no way to show, build any of the things that we did. We had to build it from scratch. So maybe you'd like, while you're there, if you'd like to go to the next tab, I can keep talking while you're working with that. So this is what we've done instead, and so I'll just talk about it there. Again, imagine this is moving, because it can. And now really imagine that it's moving, and imagine that it's illuminated as well. There we go. So the other maps were showing the spread of slavery. 4 million people moving across this vast expanse of the South. What this is showing is that areas that are blue are areas that are losing African American population. And areas that are red are areas that are gaining it. So you can see, so this is in the 18-teens, or actually 1820s. And what you can see is that Virginia is deep blue. This is the largest slave state in the Union, all the way up to the Civil War. And yet, it also saw slavery at its worst, because these are the places from which people were sold. These are the places where you might have lived here for 5 generations in Virginia, and any day that you wake up, your children could be sold away from you. And so we play this, and this is very complicated, and you can click on one of these. Each of these is a county, and it shows here who's gaining and who's losing. Look at the final bar. That's Virginia. Okay? Gives you some idea of the massive outmigration, the forced migration from the South. So, and you can see the big white areas. Those are areas that are still possessed by the American Indians. Well, those will be gone soon, and that the red area, like an infection, will spread all the way into Texas. Virginia will remain blue and get bluer over the decades as it loses more and more population. But near the end of the 1850s, some areas start turning red again. Down in Southwest Virginia, when it actually becomes more integrated into the slave economy than it had been back in these days when it's losing. So there's a bazillion pieces of evidence in this map, and it moves, and you can watch all this. But the other thing, you can see where it says narratives. You click on that, and it's the stories of people held in slavery who were talking about what it was like to be part of that process. So you can compare what we had in the 1930s, sort of grayscale, cross-hatching, and you'd be on a page, you could kind of look at them. But now we're able to put this into every schoolroom in the country, that people can actually see that the slave trade was not big red arrows going from one place to another, but rather it was a million people sold from the eastern South to the western. Okay? More than we have in the African slave trade. And we don't really wrap our minds around that as we could. Maybe now we can see it. Other things that people tried to do at the time, one of the people in my book, I have a new book coming out in the fall, I'll talk about that a little bit later, is Jed Hotchkiss from Augusta County, goes up in the mountains here. He's a civilian, but he goes to Stonewall Jackson and said, I'm an amateur topographer. Do you need one? Yeah, make me a map of the valley. And Jed Hotchkiss makes an 8-foot-long, incredibly detailed map of the valley that stops at your northern border of your county and then goes all the way up to Winchester, where it kind of ends, kind of like ancient maps of the known world. It just becomes blank. And the Valley Pike seems to go up there, but no, we don't know what happens after. Incredible detail. And so Jed Hotchkiss looks at this beautiful landscape and has to imagine where you might position guns or how you might make an escape. And so people are imagining the Civil War, visualizing it, even as they are fighting it. Now, other people have tried to think of other ways to, so that moved. This is the way people often have tried to represent the Civil War. This is from a group that does remarkable work, the Civil War Preservation Trust. And here you see it's the red boxes and the blue boxes, and they're moving, okay? And that's useful. Thank you for the cursor, by the way. I feel good about things now. That this is the way this is a direct legacy from the maps of the Civil War era themselves, where they drew red boxes and blue boxes to represent the various sizes of the troops. And this allows us to see that simultaneity thing that I was talking about. Well, we tried doing it in other ways, and let's see which one. These look like they maybe moved around a little bit. Let's see if that's not it. That's not it. That's not it. Maybe this is it. Yes. So you will recognize Augusta County, Stanton, and Franklin. And so one of the things that we did, okay, how would you imagine what war was the experience of moving all around? So this is one unit from Augusta County. You have to imagine this is a beautiful green, by the way, that looks kind of like the colors outside when you can see it. And it's showing across time where they're moving. And each one of these is an entrance into a database of the men who fought in that place. I'm very proud of this. 1998. And it still works. This is the only thing that I know. The whole Valley of the Shadow, when I left UVA in 2007 to go to Richmond, the library said they invested money to take apart the whole Valley of the Shadow and make sure every link works. And I just wrote a book out of it this last year. And so this is important for digital humanities, that you can finish something in 2007 and in 2016 it still works, which is an important thing because people are saying, well, I can write a book. It's going to be there for a long time. This digital stuff, I remember when we first started all this. Are you guys tired yet? This is from the Stonewall Brigade. Gives you an idea of the gentleman from this town, of what he led. I don't want to ruin the story, but they're almost, one more, there you go. I forgot what I was saying. I was thinking about Appomattox. So something else that I would say then is, how would you represent the complexity of this? If this is one regiment of the Confederate Army, try to imagine what the actual war looked like. That's why we went back to that original thing. Okay? Those were just the major battles. Imagine, if you would, how much movement is going on. Well, if you pulled the camera back and didn't think of the war as a series of battles like beads on a string. Oh, wait, is it time for Gettysburg yet? People have no idea these things are going to happen. There's no reason for Gettysburg to be at Gettysburg. People are constantly improvising. And we know these things now. I mean, Appomattox Courthouse is nothing. It just happens to be between Richmond and the supplies at Lynchburg. But now it's Appomattox, right? We have these names. But in order to understand the Civil War, you have to forget everything you know about the Civil War. You have to forego the knowledge that you have of how things turned out if you want to have any chance of understanding it. Because in 1864, Abraham Lincoln is almost not reelected. In August of 1864, Lincoln himself does not think he's going to be reelected. And if he's not, George McClellan, running on a peace platform, is. So this idea that the Civil War is inevitable, that of course slavery is going to be destroyed, of course the United States is going to be put back together, of course the South couldn't fight that long, none of that's true. And it's almost to the very end of the war, things are still hanging. Why didn't they turn out? Two things. Sherman takes Atlanta, but Sheridan takes the Valley. Without those two things happening, all of American history could have been different. So my own belief is that the turning point of the Civil War is not a battle at all, but rather a selection of 1860. Now that's one of the things that I really want to emphasize is, this is the maps we have in our textbooks, in which the Civil War, that's kind of complicated. You got the red North and the secessionist South, and deeply conflicted Virginia. This is something people don't realize. Virginia did not want to secede. And places like Rockbridge and Augusta sent delegates to Richmond to save the United States. Because we are the mother of presidents. We're the mother of the country. We are the largest slave state, and so we can talk to our sister slave states. But we are also the foundation of this country. And so they go to Richmond and they talk for months and months and months. It is that long. 3 months, weeks and weeks and weeks. And it's all written down, so we have 3,000 pages of their debates. And another site that I can show you, we digitized all that in time for the anniversary of secession so that people, instead of just repeating the same things, they didn't secede because of this or that. It's the tariff. And you can look into it, and the tariff is mentioned 81 times among those 3,000 pages, and slavery's only mentioned 1,432 times, right? This idea that had nothing to do with slavery is invented after the war. At the time, they would have said, well, of course. And so we show that. But here's the thing. This is the complexity and what you can do with digital. That's the same election on the county level, okay? Look what it actually looks like. Look how divided Virginia is. Look how many men in the Mississippi Delta are voting not to secede, okay? And the Republican, look how many people are not voting for the Republicans in the North. So suddenly you hear people today talking about red states and blue states. That's what those people are like. No, they're not. Even in their own county, there are people next door who are voting for the other party. So we allow this simplicity of the industrial North and the agrarian South, which is nonsense, or of the red states and the purple states in this case. But that's not true. One of the great things that digital allows you to do is turn up the magnification. So one of the things that we can do, I showed you that map of the fighting, but we can then go through because of the Valley of Shadow and look at every man in the 5th and see where he came from and all his background. So there are 952 men. When they enlisted, I can tell you when everybody was wounded, the color of their eyes, all these kinds of things. So it's very easy when you got big red blocks and blue blocks. That's the North and the South, the gray team and the blue team. It's a lot harder when you're reading the letters from a wife whose husband's injured, shot in the leg. A friend writes her and says, Sylvester's been wounded. He's probably really not far from here at all, a plasterer. But the next letter is, we were wondering why you didn't come to Philadelphia to see him in the hospital because Sylvester has died. And he asked for it, it's like, okay, a casualty. On the other hand, think about that woman being haunted the rest of her life of not being able to see Sylvester McElhenney. Okay, that is the kind of haunting history that if you turn up the magnification to have actual humans in the story. But the problem is, we can do that, but it's easy to lose a sense of the big network that the war is. Rather than thinking of the war as a series of discrete events, you've got to imagine the whole thing as incredibly connected network that's extending across. If you're a Union soldier, men are coming all the way from Minnesota to Maine and everywhere and into the South. A map of the war that would capture anything that it was like would have lines to all those men. And the men who are fighting in Virginia are from all across the South. They're not just from here. So if you're imagining where the impact of these battles are, you can't just go to the battlefield and go to the monuments and see that. We have to imagine complex networks, which is another thing that the digital is so good at showing. So this is one of the things that we made in an article. This is emancipation. Okay, so Lincoln's laws, the maps and textbook look like that up at the top. If you can make it the zones of emancipation, you can show that it looks nothing like just the state boundaries, but it's following the Union Army. And then you can show with greater complexity. So look at this. This is one that we've made using the official records of the War of the Rebellion. And those of you who are students of the Civil War know what this is. It's 126 volumes. And working with undergraduates at UR, we went through and recorded everywhere that African Americans came into contact with the United States Army. So it's all the blue dots. You can see I'm talking about Maine to Minnesota, gathering, forming, and coming into the South. So we're only up to end of 1861, and you're already seeing that African Americans are not going, wait, are we free yet? They're saying, I hear there are Yankees nearby. I'm willing to risk my life to get near them. And you see Virginia is has more of this than anywhere else. But you can also see along the South Carolina coast. You can see in Tennessee where Grant has been. You can see in New Orleans, which is already falling. All of these kinds of, that emancipation is taking place throughout the war. So this is a lot of information that we could never wrap your mind around as a human, right? This is what a machine is good at. It doesn't care. Sure, I'll show you 5,000 pieces of evidence at the same time. It's all just bits to me. But by doing so, we're able to reimagine most important thing that ever happened in this country, the end of perpetual bondage for 4 million people. To be able to see the complicated patterns. And we're only up to the middle of the war. Look how much has been going on, right? So it's not red boxes and blue boxes. It's people risking their lives. Now, we could go up, there it says emancipation event types. And what you would see is that if you're an 18-year-old woman with a baby and you hear the Yankees are 15 miles away, let's say you're in Lexington and you hear that Hunter's in Stanton. Is it worth taking the risk to go up the pike to get there? A lot of things can happen to you in the meantime, and when you do get there, the Yankees might not be welcoming, especially if they happen to be getting ready to come right back down to Lexington. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And you can see there, too, that the Union Army is not built to have all these refugees. And so in recent years, we've learned that maybe 100,000 African American people died in refugee camps or of illness in this effort to make themselves free. That's the Civil War too. Everything that I'm showing you is the Civil War. These are not ancillaries, it's not social history, that's not really the war. This is the war. And this actually affects more people. So I believe that you have to understand military history in every bit of its complexity and specificity. I'm not one of these that just has the battles in the background. If you're going to understand war, you have to understand war making. But just because you're interested in that doesn't mean you can't also be interested in the history of slavery and interested in women. So some of the things we've tried to do is then figure out, well, everybody thinks that the Valley didn't really have slavery, which is a common story. It's really the movie Shenandoah, where basically Jimmy Stewart's big strapping sons are deciding whether they're going to set out the war or not. That's not an option you actually had. Well over 90% of all white, able-bodied Southern men fight. It's not like, I just don't really think I care about it. It doesn't matter, okay? So we made a map here of slavery in Augusta County. Augusta County, I don't know what the percentage is in Lexington and Rock Bridge. Anybody know? But Augusta County has the same percentage of enslaved people as the South as a whole. A quarter of the population is African American, and most of it's almost all of them are held in slavery. So Augusta County is typical of most of the South. Most enslaved people were not on cotton plantations. And so you can't really tell very clear. But we went in and saw where all the slaveholders were. If you see the blue dots, that's all the places where people who owned slaves were. And you see they're neighbors to all the people who don't. 3/4 of white Southerners in Augusta County and in the South as a whole don't own slaves. But it's important to know that everybody was living near somebody who did, because it says a lot about what your economy is like and what you might believe in. So these are all different kinds of maps that we've made, and we've made a lot more, and I can show you in the question and answer if you like. But as you heard from the provost, I sat down with the Valley of the Shadow and wrote a book. I was actually out in California at the time at Stanford, and all I had was a laptop. This is 1999, so laptops weren't really that great. And with nothing but this, sit down and wrote the book. So this is what the Valley of the Shadow looks like, and this is all the different archives. And so I published that book in 2003, and it goes from John Brown's raid up to the day before Gettysburg. And it tries to explain how could it be that people who believed in the Union as much as the people in Rockbridge and Stanton and Augusta County would then give themselves so wholeheartedly to the Confederacy. How could you be saying in November that you are for the United States above all else, and if you are not, you are a traitor, and then 4 months later enlist in the Confederate Army. Now people just say, well, they're fighting for their way of life, or all these kind of little formulas. Well, they were fighting because history moves us in ways that we're not expecting. And in many ways, they had no choice if they ever wanted to have a date, if they ever wanted to be respected by their neighbors. And they were swept up in this. So I wrote this book to try to explain. And in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, the other one there, they're not looking to fight. They don't have any trouble with slaveholders. There are some abolitionists in there, but generally they're fine. But they end up coming in Virginia and fighting and tearing up the railroad and all those kinds of things. How does that happen? So the presence of my enemies, try to explain that. Well, that was 2003, and then they made me Dean of Arts and Sciences at Charlottesville. And so that book came out 18 months into my deanship, and then I was planning to do that, then quit, and then write volume 2, because I told my publisher, said, I'm getting ready to be dean. I can give you 500 pages now that go up to the day before Gettysburg, or you can wait an indefinite period, and I will give you 1,000 pages that goes all the way. He says, let's see what you have now. So I went ahead and published half a book, and it was fine. But for the last 14 years, it's weighed on me that we built this Valley of the Shadow thing with all of this incredible stuff in it. Wouldn't it be a sin not to finish it? So 6 years as dean, 8 years as president. Last year, got to set out in the country and write this book. So you may say, okay, you got all this stuff, but you know what? I like books. I like Civil War history just as it is. And I'm not really interested in a bunch of patterns and maps and charts and graphs. And as a humanist, and I know a lot of my humanist friends think this, and the technology we have isn't broken. It's called words on a page. It seems to have done pretty well over the last couple of millennia. So I'm trying to say, well, we can see the digital lets us see things we couldn't see otherwise. Does that mean that we can no longer write narrative history? So I'm going to read you just a little bit of this book that'll be out next fall. It's called The Thin Light of Freedom, Civil War and Emancipation in the Heart of America. And it goes from Gettysburg through the 15th Amendment. But a large part of it takes place right around here, because I burned the valley. And at both ends. We burned Chambersburg to the ground, but we also, we come here. And here's how I translate this archive to some writing. While in Stanton on June 6th, David Hunter received orders from Grant that spelled out the task before him. General Philip Sheridan was being sent from Richmond to Charlottesville, 25 miles to the east on the other side of the Blue Ridge, quote, to commence there the destruction of the Virginia Central Railroad, destroying this way as much as possible. The complete destruction of this road and of the canal and James River is of great importance to us. So Hunter was supposed to go from Stanton to Lynchburg for, quote, it would be of great value to us to get possession of Lynchburg for a single day. He said the single day because, quote, the city was of so much importance to the enemy, the Confederacy, that taking it would be extremely difficult. So Hunter was supposed to follow the shortest route to the Virginia Central Railroad, which is basically I-64 from Stanton to Charlottesville, destroying it completely and thoroughly until you joined General Sheridan. If that wasn't possible, then it would be okay if he headed south through the valley directly to Lynchburg. So Hunter says, God, it's a big mountain. And I think I'll just take the easier route and go down to Lexington. I hear good things about Lexington, and get on the way to Lynchburg. Now, while Hunter paused in Stanton, George Crook's larger force arrived from West Virginia. So when you're picturing the fighting in the valley, soldiers are converging from the south and from the west and from the east and from the north. Because the valley is just an extension in 1864 of Grant's effort to take Richmond. So that's where you got to pull the camera back and not just tell this one story, but to understand the big pattern. And what's going on is that Grant is finally, after all these years, said we're going to hit the Confederates everywhere they are. And we're going to hit them in Richmond on the Overland Campaign. We're also going to come up the James again. But the main thing we need to do is to destroy this rail network that is sustaining Lee's army. So the Civil War, in many ways, is about tearing up railroads. especially for the Confederacy. It's not so much about moving your red box in front of the blue box. It's about breaking the networks. So in the same way that our networks allow us to see networks and these complex patterns, we can understand that what a battle is, including the burning of the valley. So what they're going to do is they're going to go to Lynchburg, and they're going to drive Lee out of Richmond by taking that canal and the railroad from Lynchburg. So there's two railroads, one from Stanton to Charlottesville, and another from Lynchburg to Richmond. The valley here is emptying itself of food to feed Lee's army from Lynchburg, reaching into Tennessee. That's the only thing that's keeping Lee alive in 64. Now, what's going to happen? Crook says, we might take Lynchburg, but depend upon it. Lee would not permit us to hold it long, nor could we do so for want of supplies. If we expect to take Lynchburg at all, we must move upon it immediately and rapidly. So there they are in Stanton, and the word is what you got to do is get to Lynchburg as fast as you can. And so what do? They come here and burn stuff. They could have gotten there a lot faster. But this is where Hunter says, we fought at New Market. Those boys at Virginia Military Institute is a den of devils. They're spreading all this sedition. We need to burn that. And Governor Letcher's house there in Lexington, we've got to take care of all that. Meanwhile, Sheridan is supposed to be destroying the railroad on the other side of the Blue Ridge. If you've driven from Charlottesville to Richmond, you'll see the Battle of Trevilian Station, the largest mounted cavalry battle in the war. It's right there, and it's over the Virginia Central Railroad. Okay? So we've got to forget about places and instead think about networks. So it was already failing. Sheridan wasn't doing his part. So Hunter doesn't know this, that Lee is going to rush early down to Lynchburg on this railroad that's so worn out that its belly of the locomotive drags in the mud sometimes. And they have to march to Charlottesville and then catch the railroad down to Lynchburg. And some people National Park Service historians one time said to me, if they'd had one walkie-talkie, the whole Civil War would have been different. Because you can move Early's army from Richmond to Lynchburg, and the Union soldiers right here have no idea what's going on. So they're lingering in Lexington on their way down there. So when they come into Stanton, they have 20,000 Union men, and they're trying to think of what they're going to do. Now, and here's what I wrote. Lexington was the next town on the Valley Pike. Like Stanton, Lexington was a beautiful town. See? I'm pandering shamelessly, but I wrote that. That's going to be in the book. Graced by educational institutions, Washington College and the Virginia Military Institute. McCausland used the town to slow Hunter, and I was picturing this as I was driving in this evening. Hunter reported that he, quote, found the enemy's sharpshooters posted among the rocks and thickets of the opposite cliffs and in some of the storehouses at the bridge, and also occupying the buildings of the military institutes which stood near the river. Their artillery was screened behind the buildings of the town, and on some heights just beyond it, the whole position was commanded by my artillery, 30 guns. Hunter considered McCausland's strategy, quote, unsoldierly and inhuman attempt to defend an indefensible position against an overwhelming force by screening himself behind the private dwellings of women and children. He said, Hunter said, I could have destroyed the whole town, but no, that's not the kind of person I am. I prefer to spare private property and an unarmed population. So he just sent cavalry to push McCausland away. So here they burned the home of former Virginia Governor John Letcher because he had put out a proclamation. This is another crucial thing. If you're going to understand the valley, there are guerrillas all over the place. There are spies all over the place. So Hunter's come down here with this 20,000 men, but there are guerrillas breaking up his supply chains all behind him. So he's worried he's going to be coming all the way up the valley here. He's going to be isolated. He's going to be cut off. And so the battle of not the red boxes and the blue boxes, but networks of railroads and networks of guerrillas and armies way up in the mountains and converging from all sides, and it's also raging in Richmond at the same time. Now, picture two, all the networks of newspapers that are carrying this word, people trying to figure out what's going on. Picture the networks of letters that are going out to loved ones whenever they get the chance. That's what the Civil War looks like. It looks more like that first graph than we saw than the ones we've been making since. It's all these things going on simultaneously. So they burn here, and because Fletcher had said to wage guerrilla warfare, quote, against the Vandal hordes of Yankee invaders. So then they burn VMI, and then they finally hear that Lynchburg's not strongly defended, and there's only shallow rifle pits. All the sick and wounded had been organized to defend the place, they heard. So they were going to go down and destroy it. Now, I hope you're picturing it all. But what does this look like from one individual? A guy with a great name, I just want to say his name to read a letter from him. Achilles Tynes, fighting with McCausland, wrote his wife Hattie, describing what the protracted struggle against Hunter's federal force looked like. The officer adopted a playful tone to describe, this is his brand new wife. It's okay, I'm done. Hitachi's not, I like the beautiful scene though, if we're going to do that. Okay. So it'd be good if something else were there. I'm not getting anything from Hitachi for this amount of advertising to do all that. So Tynes is early 20s. Hattie and he were married right before the war. And he says, I'm writing a letter, quote, so as to test my own identity and self-possession and equilibrium, which I have very nearly lost. So rapidly have events chased each other, and so wearying has been the last 10 or 15 days. In all my experience of war, I have never been so chased, pursued, dogged. After escaping the Federals following the battle at Piedmont, up I-64, I took my wife one Sunday afternoon and said, hey, honey, I've been writing about the Battle of Piedmont. Let's go see what it looks like. There's just a monument the size of this lectern that we had to use GPS to find. And I said, just imagine there were 5,000 men here fighting and dying, and now there's not even a pull-off. So as you think about what parts of history remain, or how our memory works, and seeing these networks, that's something that kind of haunted me. So they've escaped the Federals, they head in this direction, and they dare to get close to Stanton. This so enraged them that early next morning, Crooks and Averell, 12,000 strong, marched out against us, swearing that they would drive McCausland to hell. And really, from the way he has put us through from there to this place, Lexington, seems like he would be able to keep his word. The Confederates faced a force several times their size. They couldn't fight them directly, but if they just fought them while they were running away, they could be overrun. Quote, if we turned our backs, 'twas a ruinous rout. If we moved back fighting, slowly the flanking columns would pass and engulf us. Here was a dilemma, he writes his wife. They chose the latter strategy, keeping one little squadron well mounted, sternly and slowly getting in the road, thus retreating and fighting the entire day for 30 miles, Stanton to Lexington. The Confederates finally arrived in Lexington, quote, we're footsore, hungry, and exhausted. We were determined to rest. Tynes, who was an officer, quote, saw the men had rations for the night. That's something we tend to forget too. You got to move food for all these men, and there is no refrigeration. So when you're picturing the red boxes and the blue boxes, you got to picture them marching herds of cattle and pigs. Okay? And to try to, how are you going to feed these men? Now, if you're the Union and they've cut off your supply chains, really what are you going to do? But even if you're the Confederates and things are hard, you're an officer, the first thing you got to do is some way to feed these men. Then I threw myself upon the ground, exhausted, gloomy, and sad. This has been the hardest day of my experience. In the fighting the next day right here, McCausland tried to slow Hunter any way he could. Tynes darkly joked with his wife, quote, you came very near being reduced several times to the necessity of hunting up another husband. Not knowing what would follow on the succeeding day, he said, you are a soldier's wife, and hence I shall talk plain, even though I don't want to disturb you or make you sad. Then he listed all the money owed him by the Confederate government and his fellow officers. He said, this will be irrelevant if I live, but if not, quote, it would furnish data for his new bride to receive what was owed her. Who would have thought that people would have said in a letter to his wife, it will furnish data? But he did. So the shifting leadership among the Confederates in the summer of 1864 deepened the confusion. Now, I'm going to end my pandering with an alum of Washington College and one of the lead characters of my book, John Imboden, who grew up in Stanton, came down to Washington College, well-educated, became a lawyer, ran for the secession convention and lost because he was for secession. And then he goes from being county court clerk to being the head of a partisan Rangers. He advertises, if he really wants to shoot some Yankees, join me. And they get rewarded everything that they can commandeer, they get a slice of. So John Imboden, in just a few years, goes from this. He works at the Institute in Stanton. Now he's the head. He's General Imboden, the head of the partisan guerrillas. And he protected the valley in the months when it seemed forgotten by the Richmond government. But now that they needed it again, both to supply Lee's army and to control these railroads, now he finds himself shoved aside because Lee sends John C. Breckinridge to replace John Imboden. Here's another thing to think about how the Civil War was actually impossible. Who's John C. Breckinridge? 4 years earlier, he was Vice President of the United States. And now he's being sent from Southwest Virginia up here to take over the forces from John Imboden and to try to see what he can say. There's a great story when, a little bit later in the war, Breckinridge and Jubal Early, the head of the Confederate Army later, they just got whipped at Winchester, and they're riding back south in the valley, and Early turns to Breckinridge. He says, how are you feeling about slavery in the territories right now? And that was just like, doesn't really seem quite that pressing right now. Breckinridge laughed. That's the thing, too. These people were human. They had senses of humor. You can see this young man and young woman. You very nearly came close to having to hunt up another husband. It's important for us to remember that they were just as complicated as we were and probably better writers. So an adjutant to Breckinridge said that Imboden tolerated, quote, wild cavalry, of the inefficiency of which there was constant complaint and almost daily exhibition. Breckinridge complained to the generals in Richmond that Imboden's cavalry had been less than nothing. So here's Imboden, who's fought for years in the mountains all around here, trying to defend the valley with almost no men. He has to publish articles in the local newspaper begging people to give him money. If you've got a horse we could have, we would love to have that. And then he's kind of pushed aside. I love this. I don't love this. It's a powerful story. Later, John Imboden founds Damascus in down 81. Does 81 go up or down? Like, I mean, you know, you call that down? So the river goes up and the interstate goes down? Okay. And he goes down there, and in 1890s, he says, he names it Damascus because it's the oldest city in the world that they know of. And he's going to create a great empire because there they have coal and the iron. It's going to be Pittsburgh in Southwest Virginia. And instead, he's down there. He leaves his fourth wife and their children in Richmond, and he freezes to death in a cabin and dies of typhoid fever in 1894 out of this dream of making this industrial enterprise out of that. So what I'm trying to persuade you is that too often we divide ourselves into camps or styles or groups that we don't need to. We can write a Civil War history that's just as juicy as what I read you because these great people wrote these great letters. And it's not diminished by the fact that we're thinking about new technologies where we can actually see these patterns. And it's not diminished by including African American people in the story. It's not watered down if we have women in the story. It's not distorted by having both the North and the South in the story. It's not ruined by understanding that people change their minds in the pressure of history. Without being hypocrites, they can change their minds. So the good news is, here we live, the most profound social change of our time is the invention of instantaneous global network of free information exchange. Surely we can think of something cool to do with it, right? And when we do, it doesn't mean we have to lose the old virtues of storytelling and of empathy and entering into a place that we didn't know. But it would be good for us if we understood how it is that history can suddenly pivot and things far worse than you can imagine can happen overnight. Virginia's destroyed by this war. But things far better than you can imagine can also happen. The end of perpetual bondage for 4 million people and the saving of the United States. I find that young people in particular imagine that the future is just going to be more of the present. I grew up in the segregated South and watched the civil rights movement come. People in this room have watched same-sex marriage suddenly become supported by a great majority of the population. The only pattern I've been able to discover, the only law of history I've been able to discover is what people expect to happen never does. What's the moral of that? Be very alert. Be careful what you say, because you end up doing a lot of the things that you say. And you think things can't happen, watch out, because they can. But things that you think are always going to be wrong don't have to stay that way. Sometimes things can get better. So that's the Civil War and digital history and how they interact. You can't possibly have believed all that, so I'm going to get some water, and I want to see some hands and hear some hard questions. So we're going to do that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, you can't raise your hand if you're applauding,
Yeah.
so I want to. Yes?
I can bring a mic back if you.
Oh, good.
With a hand. Yeah.
People are so well dressed.
Thank you. What are some of the limitations of digital humanities?
It's really, we don't know because we're just barely trying it. I'll tell you what's hard about the digital humanities. It took us 14 years to build the Valley of the Shadow. Okay? To type in every census for 2 places is a long time. 10,000 pages of newspapers, which machines still can't really read. So in order to do something like that, you have to mobilize yourself on a scale that humanists aren't used to mobilizing themselves. At Richmond, we call it the Digital Scholarship Lab because it's much more like a science lab than anything else. So like in the Visualizing Emancipation thing, we had students from 18 different majors working on that, right? So you have to, writing this book, I was just all by myself all day long. But to make any of this digital stuff, I couldn't make anything by myself. So it's a limitation because it requires us to work on a scale and a collaborative. I mean, that's one thing that's great about folks in this room. People bringing the library and IT and the disciplines together. You don't see it anywhere else. The hard part is you have to bring the library and IT and all the disciplines together, right? So we barely know what the limitations are. But here's the thing. So when we built the Valley of the Shadow, all this stuff is probably in 50 different archives, including people's houses in Augusta County and up in Franklin. People would loan us and let us Xerox things and type them in. So when I went to Richmond and we started the Digital Scholarship Lab, I said, hey, here's an idea. We already have lots of data. What do you say we just think about ways to see the patterns in it? So that forced migration map of the slave trade, that data already exists. It's just that we hadn't devised the tools to be able to see beyond just big numbers. So, as I mentioned earlier, pleading for your sympathy, PDF files didn't exist when we began, right? It is so much easier now than it was in 1993, the first year of the web, that the things that we can do. But we're not very much because, and that's the reason the theme of my talk was, the digital does not displace the humanistic. But we imagine that it does. We imagine that Twitter is shortening our attention spans. Right? What was I saying? And you hear all that sort of thing. So I think it's important that those of us who are old try to show how these are amplifications of what we want to do rather than replacements for it. Because you'll notice, making all this stuff until we turn it back into language, until we turn it back into a story, until we turn it into an explanation in words, it's just a picture, right? So the limitations are that it's new. The excitement is it's new. Young people get to invent a whole vocabulary, a whole genre. There's nothing it has to be. So that's what's exciting about it. Limitations that we barely discovered them, except that it's kind of hard to do. All right, good question. What else we got?
Other questions?
There's two over on this side. Here we go.
So any humanistic research project is going to yield some surprises to the researcher. What was it about this project, and specifically its digital quality, that elicited the biggest surprises from you?
How lucky I was, for one thing. Okay, so I'll just tell you, I chose Augusta and Franklin because I knew that their soldiers faced each other at most of the major battles in the East. And I knew that both places had 2 newspapers throughout this entire era. If you can imagine that. A town of 4,000, Stanton, every week telling us what went on. Okay? Other than that, I had no idea what I would find. Did I know that in my northern community, it's where John Brown would meet with Frederick Douglass? No. Did I know that Joseph Waddell, sitting in Stanton, would write down every single thought that he had for the entire Civil War, even though it was sitting there in the UVA library and nobody had ever really transcribed everything? No. Did I know that the only diary in the entire Civil War, a husband and wife came at the same time, so you can actually see what the husband and wife are thinking on exactly the same day all the way through? No. Did I know that Jedediah Hotchkiss was from Augusta County and would write letters back to his wife, Sarah, showing what the Civil War looks like from the Confederate tent? No. Did I know that just the year as I was finishing up this book, other historians found an enslaved man who was 6 years old during the Civil War, but then grew up in Stanton. In the late 1880s, he has a new child, and he sits down one day to write the story of his life and told what it was like to be born a slave in Augusta County and to live through and see his father taken off to dig fortification in Richmond and never come back and grow up. And then the same guy ends up being one of the founders of the Republican Party in Virginia, runs his own newspaper, teaches school for 30 years. Did I know that? No, and nobody else did either. So what's cool is that the same kind of humanistic surprises that we all find whenever we go into the archive are all over the place. There was a review at the Valley of the Shadow in 1995. It said, this is different than a library digitizing its holdings. This is what he called an intentional archive. We just went out and found every piece of information we could find about every person who lived in these 2 places. And we went and got it from, we had what we called a history harvest in Stanton. We set up shop and said, do you have something you'd be willing to come in and let us scan? And then it'll be in the Valley of the Shadow. So there's millions and millions of pieces of evidence in this. To write these books, I'm guessing that I'm using 3%. Okay? Now you might say limitations of digital history to make 100% to distill it down to 3. Fortunately, I told the very best story that could possibly be told. Who knows if I did or not, right? So there was all those kinds of surprises. That the reason people do history, you're surprised by. But every letter, like discovering Achilles Tynes, who has this letter, I didn't care anything about it until I knew about Lexington and that what was going on. That right now, that the entire United States depends on whether Lee can hold off Grant, maybe through the election of 1864. Okay? That's the thing. Come on, Grant, we're giving you 2 million men. You can't take Lee? And if they can come and break these railroads here seemingly far from it, then the war could have been shortened by 6 months and maybe had a different outcome. So the discovery for me was that all these things are connected in ways, not being a military historian, that I'd not understood. But I'd have to say there's no history of the entire Valley campaign of 1864. And so I had to piece it all together myself. And I guess the other thing I discovered is how hard and interesting military history is for somebody who just read a lot of books before. So anyway, I hope some of those would strike you as a reasonable answer. But I've talked long enough that we're ready for the next question. Yes, sir. Wait 1 second, please. Right here in the front. I want you to be amplified. Wait just 1 second.
Oh, you can probably hear me. You've obviously been interested for 20, 25 years in digital and manipulating
Right.
the information. Let's go forward 100 years. Let's say that all that you have done is
Yeah.
in a chip, whatever you got in that little
Yeah.
PC up there. Talk about the archival. I think it's a problem, but the archival nature, what could be done or is done if you really wanted to preserve what
Yeah.
you've got in
That's
your
great.
program.
Great question. Well, as my wife said, when we went to Lowe's and looked at shingles for our house, and I pointed out that these had a 50-year warranty, her comment was, "We'll be so dead." So we do have that virtue, as I will never know. So the Valley of the Shadow, everything in it is just ASCII text that could be put in any different kind of form. If I really want to save it, I should print it all out. That's the honest truth, right? On the other hand, here's the way I think about it. I've not added up lately, but we used to have 1 million people a year look at the Valley of the Shadow, okay? And it's used all over the world. And people will come up to me and say, in middle school we did this and so forth. More people will look at that website in a week than will read until this next book comes out. Then it's going to be a bestseller, I promise. Then read my book. So here's what I'm willing to trade. I'm willing to trade global reach now for nothing to all these people rather than trying to guess what might happen in the future. But in the meantime, put everything in a form that can be changed. We've already rebuilt the valley once. Actually, when we first started, we started in WordPerfect. If anybody can imagine that. And I went to give one of the early presentations in San Francisco in the Hilton, but they didn't have internet. And so I had transparencies and put an overhead projector, and I said, imagine that I could click on this and it would make this. Okay? So seeing how fast things have changed, it won't take a chip. I mean, whatever, everything that we've made it's on a hair. Do I think it will endure in that form? No. I mean, you saw how giddy I was that we made something in 1998 that wasn't embarrassing looking now. The rate of change is so radical. But I don't want to be dishonest. I've written books because the book is going to endure. So that's my point, is that these are not displacing genres, but enabling genres. I don't think I could have written the books without the digital stuff. I don't think that I could have seen the story that I'm trying to tell. And I have a new interpretation of Reconstruction and all that from the same thing that comes from all this data. So when I first began, one time I gave a talk in Wales for some reason. And one of my friends there showed me a note that he'd handed to a friend of his during my talk, and it said Evangelical Ed, because I believe in this so much. But I do understand the limitations of it. Fortunately, as a historian, I know we're all dead pretty soon anyway. It doesn't really matter. Nobody will remember. But if you can make a difference while you're here, that's what I care about. Another good question along that line, what's going to happen? What's going to be the archive of our lives? On one hand, nobody's ever been as documented as we are with our Twitter feeds and Facebook things. But what's going to happen to that? Be careful. Yes?
For one more question.
Oh, just one? Okay.
Thanks a lot for that. Very persuaded by your emphasis on networks, systems. Agree
Great.
with that. And I wonder,
That's all the time we have for this evening, then.
how do you hear your students talking about network systems? I wonder, I don't want this to sound like kids do gizmos and kids have the social network, but they're finding themselves through a different generation than you are, than we are.
Yeah.
And I don't know if they see this map differently before they even get into it.
A problem that we have, I'm teaching a class of freshmen right now. We went to the library today, and the question was, okay, how's a library work? And it's the same thing as Facebook and Twitter. You're looking for, how do you know what to go to, right? I thought it was a brilliant presentation the librarian gave about all that. But it's very clear that this is just the water that these fish are swimming in, that there's no sense that this is actually interesting other than as a consumer good, right? They've grown up. I asked them, can you remember a time before the web? And of course they can't. There's never been that. So whenever I get a chance to talk to young people, I just point out that you're fluent in this in a way that geezers like me who can remember when they saw the first everything are not. But ironically, because they are, in some ways you're waiting for a big company to make the next gee whiz app rather than thinking about what you might be able to do with it yourself. Now, this is like Heathkit days back in the beginning. It wasn't so overwhelming. You could imagine we could do something with it ourselves. But today, how do you compete with companies that spend $4 billion or whatever to make a video game with photorealism and all this? So, I gave a talk at the Library of Congress one time, maybe 12 years ago, and I was calling for this, and a young woman stood up. She said, "You make me want to cry." I said, "Why is that?" She said, "Because there's a whole generation of us who want to do what you're talking about, and they won't let us." I said, "Who's they?" She said, "Our friends, our parents, that they're afraid that we'll go down this rabbit hole and start making something instead of writing a book we need to do." So we've got one foot on the accelerator and one foot on the brake. But I'll end with this thought. Surely those of us who have responsibility for the entire record of the human experience can think of something cool to do with all these new technologies within our reach. Today in the newspaper, for example, you may have seen this. They've been able to read a scroll of Hebrew, and it's just like a charred cinder. But the computer could unfurl it so you could read these words from one of the earliest versions of the Bible. Okay? I see this in a more humble thing here in American history, all in English. It's kind of unfurling a history that we think we know and showing it to us in a strange way. And that's an exciting prospect. I believe that kids, they love the geographic stuff. They've walked around with a digital atlas in their pocket their whole lives, right? And it occurs to them that the people who come to history class often define themselves as people who aren't interested in that. They're interested in books, right? They're word people, not number people. And what I'm trying to suggest to them, that distinction doesn't exist anymore. Now you can be a new kind of person, because what is history? History is only all the information we have about everything that happened before today. That's all history is. It's no story. There's no shape. We go back and discover it. Now we have, I keep saying this is the end, but really I'm going to end with this. How are the sciences transformed? By tools of observation, by telescopes, by microscopes, and then by ever more powerful versions of proton splitters and things. These are our very crude telescopes and microscopes where we can see patterns that we could not have seen before with the unaided eye. I think we'll rise to the occasion and people will find cool things to do. I just hope that they don't laugh too hard at these early crude efforts. Thank you all so much.